So we are all familiar with the story of Job. I'll actually do a more in-depth study of the book of Job in the near future. By that I mean about 12 months from now on a Wednesday night. Because we spend time, which is what we're going to do today, in chapters 1 and 2 and chapter 42. But we tend not to spend a whole lot of time on the in-between part, which is really the meat of the book, is the parts that we tend to skip over. And I think we skip over a lot of it because it's poetry, and few of us like poetry. Jewel is unique in that regard. But that's to see the interaction between Job and his friends is an important aspect of the book of Job. And that's why God gave it to us. And that demands that we study it and not just pass over it. Job is mentioned outside of the book of Job twice. Ezekiel mentions Job along with Noah and Daniel, which is interesting because skeptics argue against some of the events in the life of Daniel, obviously because they're miraculous. They criticize Noah and the flood, obviously because it's miraculous. And Job is just a fictional character whose life is written down in poetry form. And yet Ezekiel refers to these three men as historical characters. They were real people. And Ezekiel obviously had copies of their books. How about that? Now that's how he knew about them. Job is also mentioned in James 5 and verse 11, where James praises Job's perseverance. Job chapter 42, if you want to turn over there, verses 7 through 9, after everything is said and done with Job, it came about after the Lord has spoken these words, which is the speeches that God gave back in chapter, I believe they started in chapter 37. It came about after the Lord has spoken these words to Job that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, one of Job's friends, "My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends because you've not spoken of me what is right as," notice how God refers to him. "You've not spoken right about me as my servant Job has. Now therefore take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves, and my servant Job will pray for you, for I will accept him so that I may not do with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right as my servant Job." So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord told them, and the Lord accepted Job. So what? 4 times in those 3 verses, God refers to Job as a servant. Back in the first chapter, chapter 1 and verse 8, the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." That's God's description. That's God's view of Job. And if you look down at chapter 2 and verse 3, the Lord said this second time to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil, and he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." So in all of the struggles and challenges that Job went through, and all of the things that he said, even about God, which were not always fair to God, God still had a very high opinion of Job. God still respected Job and his faith and Job's convictions, even though Job sometimes wavered in his understanding of the nature of God. So there's a lot of questions that Job has throughout the book. And for the most part, God doesn't answer them. I think the rest of the Bible gives us an answer, or at least a closer answer, closer to something that is an answer to some of the questions that Job had. How many times do we ask, why does God allow this to happen? Why has God allowed this to happen to me? Why does God allow suffering? Well, you can give a theological or a philosophical answer, but when it comes to personal questions, most of the time it's just, I don't know. I don't know why it happened to you. I don't know why God allowed it to happen to you. So all of these times, God refers to Job as his servant. So the bulk of our study this morning is going to be on Job being a servant. First point. Job served God in good times. Why is it hard to serve God in good times? All right, we're not going any further until somebody answers that question. Why is it hard to serve God in good times? Because we're not in need. Somebody over here? Yeah. Things are going well with us, and we just think we don't need Him. I just read this morning in my daily Bible reading about King Hezekiah. And the Bible says when King Hezekiah became strong, that's when he turned away from God. And by becoming strong, it's referring to his kingdom going well, the economy is going well, everything is going well for King Hezekiah, and he just decided, I don't need God. But Job served God even when things were going well. Look at Job's goodness, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. So from a spiritual perspective, Job was doing well. He was going to church all the time. He was going to Bible study all the time. He would, if he was a Christian, he would have been involved in all the works of the church and all of that. Reading the Bible on his own, praying on his own, all of that. Go and visit people who were sick and in the hospital, all of that. That's the kind of person Job was. Verses 2 and 3. His blessings are that he had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, very many servants, and that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. He was on the list of Fortune 500. And then we see that his sons went up and held a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And Job did that continually. And so Job has a great family, and the family enjoys life, and Job is a good dad, and he's a spiritual leader in his home. Everything that you could say good, you could say about Job. Things were going well for him. Even when he was somewhat concerned about maybe his children sinned against God, so he offered sacrifices for them. And in that day and time, the dads offered the sacrifices on behalf of the children. And so Job took care of that. How could you complain against Job? How could you find something to complain against Job? We would think that it would be easy to serve God and be faithful to God when things are going well. In our day and time, generally speaking, if things are going well for us, it also means that there's a lot of demands on our time. And here's what happens. Our boss needs us to work, and so we put in a few extra hours. We start working 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week. Well, what happens to your relationship with the church when you're working 80 hours a week? You can't make it to Bible class on Wednesday night. You're too tired to be on Bible class on Sunday night. Because you're so busy during the week, you've got to have that extra time on Saturdays and all the time you can squeeze out of Sundays in order to get done around the house. What you got to do, you got to mow the yard, you got to fix a leaky faucet, you got to do all that kind of stuff. And before you know it, the bank account is going up and your spiritual life is going down. That's just what happens with human nature. and we get further and further and further away from having a strong spiritual relationship with God and His church because things are going well for us. Job served God even when things were going well. One man wrote, "If life is to have meaning and if God's will is to be done, all of us have to accept who we are and what we are and give it back to God and thank Him for the way He made us. What I am is God's gift for me, and what I do with it is my gift to God." But when things are going well, the temptation is for us to give our all to our job and give scraps to the church. That's the temptation for us when things are going well. But what about Job and his service to God when things are going badly? Why is it hard to stay faithful to God when things are going badly? You think God's not with you, that God has failed you. Where is God when I hurt? That's a question we ask ourselves sometimes. If God loves me, then why has He allowed all these bad things to happen to me? If all these bad things are happening to me, then that must mean God doesn't love me. God's not listening to my prayers. God doesn't care what's happening to me. Maybe I'm not faithful enough, and if I'm not faithful enough doing what I'm doing, then there's no point in trying. That's how we tend to think when things are going badly. Well, what about Job? The first thing Job endures is that the Sabeans take his oxen and his donkeys and they kill his servants, in verses 14 and 15. And then a fire destroys his sheep and his servants. This is an agrarian economy. He lives off his farm. His business is destroyed. He gets up on a Monday morning and he goes to his business that he owns and he sees that his business is burned to the ground. The water from the firefighters has destroyed all of his electronic equipment. And guess what? He didn't have any insurance. That's Job. He's lost everything and he's going to have to start from scratch. He's lost all of his business. The Chaldeans take his camels and kills those servants, verse 17. And if that wasn't bad enough, his children get killed too. If you're a good family man and you lose your business, you find comfort and encouragement and hope in your family. He lost his family. Children are not replaceable. You might lose one child at birth and have another child, but that next child doesn't take the place of the first one you lost, does it? You don't replace children. So he lost all 7 sons and 3 daughters who were killed, verses 18 and 19. But look at Job's response in verses 20 and 21. Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head. Those are signs of mourning, distress. He fell to the ground and worshiped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Do we have that kind of faith in God? Do we have that kind of conviction in God? We get news on a Friday from the doctor that we've got some kind of terminal illness, and we feel bad. It's normal to have a pity party. That's normal. Feel sorry for myself. Woe is me. But when time to come to worship comes around on a Sunday morning, do we get up and go to worship? Job did. Job served God even when things were going badly. You study the book of Psalms, and even when David was distressed and when he was alone and when he was afraid, he still made time to worship God. The kind of men these were the kind of men who would not let life get in the way of God. Too frequently today, we wonder if God is going to get in the way of us enjoying life. Job was faithful to God even when things were going badly. Look at chapter 13 and verse 15. This is a verse that you ought to have highlighted in your Bible. And if we don't have this kind of faith in God, my challenge is we need to develop this kind of faith in God, this kind of confidence in God. Listen to Job's words to God, Job 13 and verse 15. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. Look at that first statement there. Even if God kills me, I'm still going to put my hope in him. I can be diagnosed with a terminal disease. I can lose my family. I can lose my business. I can lose my house. I'm not giving up my faith in God. Because where else are you going to go? Who are you going to put your trust in? Are you going to all of a sudden decide that when we die, we die like Rover, we're dead all over, there's no hope beyond the grave? Is that the end result? We're just going to become atheists? Job says, if in God's wisdom he takes my life, I'm not going to renounce my hope in him. Because really, there's nowhere else to go. Yeah, so many people today lose their faith when things go badly. I remember visiting Murrah Holsinger in the hospital when she was having the lung issue. And I think at that time she wasn't sure if she was going to make it. She did from that point, but at that point she didn't. And she spoke with such calmness and conviction and faith. Rachel was with me at the time, and she said, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. Even though things go badly. What's Murrah struggled with over the last 24 months? Job still served God even when things were going badly. But look what else. Job served God despite not having the support of his family and his friends. Well, I could get through almost anything with Rachel by my side. What if she were to turn her back on me? Where would I be then? Is Rachel the conduit of my faith to God? Does my faith have to pass through Rachel in order to get to God, or do I have my own faith? Could I paraphrase Job 13 and verse 15 and say, though God slay Rachel, I will still trust in him? Where's my faith in God? Or does it have to go through my wife? Chapter 2, verse 7 through 10. Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. He took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. And then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. She was hurting too, wasn't she? She also lost 7 children. She was having to go back to the spreadsheet and figure out how they were going to make ends meet when their business was destroyed. So I don't want to minimize the pain that Mrs. Job was going through as well, but her reaction to that pain was very different from Job's reaction. She said, just curse God and die. Let's get it over with. And Job said, you speak as one of the foolish women speak. Now, the Bible uses the word fool, not in the sense of somebody who's stupid. The Bible definition of a fool is someone who lives as if there is no God. So that's what Job is referring to here. He's not saying you're acting stupidly. He's saying you're acting as if there's no God. That's what he means when he says you're acting foolishly. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now that statement reflects chapter 13 and verse 15, right? Shall we not receive adversity from God? And then, of course, the rest of the book of Job, or most of the rest of the book of Job, is his friends coming to him saying all manner of harsh, blunt, false things to Job. And that requires a study that we don't have time to do this morning. We'll look at a few things. But suffering is a real difficulty for many people today. I certainly don't have the answers, not in individual circumstances. The end of our study this morning is going to be on how you and I can be better counselors to our family and friends than Job's friends were. Job served God without knowing all of the answers. So far as we know. Now, if Job was the author of the book of Job, and we don't know who wrote the book, but if Job was the author of it, then at some point the Holy Spirit revealed to him chapters 1 and 2 that Job was really a pawn on a chessboard between God and Satan. But as far as the text is concerned, Job doesn't know that's going on. He's not being persecuted because he was unfaithful. He was actually being persecuted because he was faithful. He was the prime example in God's eyes to Satan of someone who was strong spiritually. Satan doesn't believe anybody serves God because God deserves it. He believes all of us serve God just because of what we get out of it. And so for those Christians who quit being faithful to God because things are going badly, all they're doing is proving Satan right. The only reason why they're faithful to God is because things are going well for them. But God holds up Job as an example of someone who would stay faithful to God despite what Satan did to him. And so God boxed in Satan. He limited Satan. The first go around, he said, you can do anything to Satan except touch his person. You cannot touch his person. And so Satan did all of those things. Second go around, God says to Satan, you have my permission to touch Job's person, but you can't kill him. You can take him all the way up to within an inch of his life, but you can't kill him. And so Satan did it. And Job didn't know any of this. He never knew why he suffered. He just knew he was. And it wasn't related to any sins he had committed. And I think we should understand when Job goes through and he says, I'm not guilty of this sin, this sin, this sin, and this sin. I don't think Job is saying he was perfect. He just wasn't guilty of any of the sins that he was being accused of. God is the one, as we read back in chapter 1 and verse 8, who said to Satan, consider Job, because there's nobody like him, blameless and upright and fears God and shuns evil. That's God's view of Job. And sometimes we give up because we don't know the answers. We can't explain certain things. There are people who don't believe in God because they can't explain the Trinity. Well, again, what's the alternative? Where are you going to go if you don't want to believe in the God of the Bible? There's plenty of criticism to go around. You want to believe in Allah, you want to believe in Vishnu, you want to believe in Buddha. Where are you going to go? You going to be an atheist? As irrational as that position is? The Bible reveals three persons in the Godhead. You either accept it or reject it. We don't have to explain it. We either accept it or reject it. And as Arthur Conan Doyle had Sherlock Holmes say, once you've shown that every other position is irrational, whatever is left has got to be the truth. So people say, well, since I don't have all the answers, I'm not going to believe in God. That doesn't make any sense. Job didn't have the answers, but he served God anyway. And then our final point in this part of our lesson is that Job served God until he died. Right up to the last point. Job spoke what was right of God. We read that back in chapter 42. God said, Job has spoken right about me. He was faithful up to the end. Let's look at chapter 42, verses 16 and 17. We didn't read these verses earlier. Chapter 42, 16 and 17. Job lived 140 years, saw his sons and his grandsons, 4 generations. Job died an old man and full of days, having suffered extensively, but staying faithful to God through it all. We cannot control when we die. We don't know at this very moment what's going on inside of us physically. Is there some kind of ticking time bomb going on inside my heart or inside my brain? We don't know. But we can stay faithful to God through death, because that is our choice. We will be either faithful or unfaithful when we die. And that's entirely our choice. So Job was called God's servant because Job served him in all of these different ways. Now I want to take a step back and look at Job from a different perspective. And that is, how can we be counselors to others better than Job's friends were to him? When you go to a funeral home or you get the call that a family member has lost a spouse, or a friend has lost a spouse, or lost a child, tragic car accident, or whatever it might be, what do you say? What do you do? 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, we studied 2 Wednesday nights ago. Paul writes that God blesses us in our afflictions so that we can comfort others with the comfort with which we were comforted by God. How? A young couple loses a child in a car accident. A woman's husband decides that he wants to file for divorce. Maybe he's found somebody else in his life that tickles his fancy. So he decides he wants to walk away from a 20 or 30-year-old marriage. Family's house is destroyed by fire. A child of a godly family has decided to live a life of sin despite all of the teaching and prayers of mom and dad. Those are hard scenarios. They're hard things to talk about. It's the kind of conversations preachers have in their office on a Monday morning. Job was in a hard predicament. Lost his 10 kids, financial ruin, his health was a mess. His 3 friends come to comfort him, and they do a terrible job of it. If we were to read all of their speeches, we would say, well, you're an idiot saying stuff like that. We say similar things, sometimes not even realizing it. So what do you do? Number 1, show you care. Chapter 2, verses 11 through 13 is when Job's friends showed up. That's just about the only thing they did that was right. When Job's friends heard of all his adversity that had come upon him, they came each one from his own place, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. They made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and to comfort him. When they lifted up their eyes at a distance and did not recognize him, they raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. And then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw that his pain was very great. What did the friends do right? Companionship. What else? They showed up.
When Tony died, I still remember that people, and I was only 5th grade, so I remember that people physically showed up at our house. I mean, tons and tons and tons of cards and food, but I still remember the ladies who came and just came to the house and just sat with us or sat with my mom. And it was a while ago, but I still remember who was there.
Just the personal presence. What else did they do right?
They didn't say anything.
At first, they don't say anything.
Sometimes you just need to be there. You can't say anything.
Right. Sometimes we say too much, and we're going to talk about that. What else did these friends do right? Yeah. They lamented themselves, wept and cried themselves. So they shared in his pain in that way. Verse 12 says that they sympathized with him and comforted him. Notice in verse 12, and Dan may have been referring to this, each of them tore his own robe and threw dust over their heads toward the sky. That was an ancient Jewish way of showing mourning. And they did the same thing. And then they sat down on the ground with him, verse 13, for how long? A whole week. Now, Caitlin mentioned having family come by the house. These guys came by the house and stayed for a week, trying to show their support and their encouragement for Job. And at this particular point, they don't say anything. Their problem started when they opened their mouths and started sharing theology and philosophy with Job. Because in chapter 16 and verse 2, and to save time, we won't look at these verses, but at that point, Job says, "You are miserable comforters." Can you imagine going to somebody's house like Caitlin to try to encourage them, and you're saying all the wrong things so that the person who is hurting says to you, "Just shut up"? That's basically what Job has to say to his friends. You're saying all the wrong things. In chapter 13 and verse 4, he says, "You are forgers of lies. You are all physicians of no value. You are worthless in your encouragement." So we need to try to show that we care without saying and doing the wrong things. Number 2, we need to allow them to express their feelings. Sometimes people are hurting so much that they say things out of anger. They even blame God for things that Satan is the one who should be blamed and not God. We don't need to overreact to those expressions of anger. Read the book of Psalms. In the book of Psalms, when David is hurting, he says things to God that he probably would not have said to anybody else. Let God handle expressions of anger. God is big enough, mature enough, and powerful enough to absorb all of that. His Son came to earth so that God would know what it's like to be a human. God understands. Let them express their anger. Let them vent. That's a part of how we deal with our emotions. Now, there might be a time you want to go back to them when their emotions are not so raw and have a talk about some of the things maybe they said. I'm not saying completely ignore it. I'm saying don't get into a theological argument when they're in the depth of pain. That's one of the mistakes Job's friends made. We don't want to try to straighten them out. We don't want to try to solve their problems. Another mistake that we tend to make is trying to explain why things happen when we don't know why they happen. And we ought to be careful saying, don't feel that way. You shouldn't feel that way. What does that do? That complicates things. They're feeling sorrow because of this loss that they've experienced, and now we're making them feel shameful for the feelings that they have. So we need to let them express their feelings. We need to listen to their problems. These friends of Job were not listening to what Job was saying. They heard, but it wasn't what they agreed with, and so they weren't listening. They were talkers, but they weren't listeners. 90% of counseling is listening. Most people know the solutions to their problems. They just need to talk through them. With a few appropriately asked questions, most people know what the resources are to draw on, to use in order to solve the problems that's causing their issues. They just need somebody to listen. A few weeks ago, we studied Mary and Martha, resurrection of Lazarus in John chapter 11. Mary and Martha came to Jesus separately, and they said, if you had been here, you're at fault, Jesus. If you'd have been here, he wouldn't have died. Jesus didn't get into an argument with them, did he? Instead, he wept with them. He listened to their pain. I've already hinted at this. We have to watch what we say. We don't need to act like we know the answers. We don't need to act like we know all of the answers to somebody's problems. It's okay to say, I don't know. Job's friends should have said that. They didn't have the answers. Because we've got chapters 1 and 2. We know the background. The friends didn't know the background any more than Job did. They're accusing Job of all of these bad things Job supposedly had done, and yet chapters 1 and 2, we've already been told that God holds Job in very high regard. The friends are just speaking out of pure ignorance. They tried to list specific sins that Job had committed, and Job says, no, it's not right. I didn't do that. We have to watch what we say. Number 5, we can give encouragement from the Bible. And we can share experiences. We can share how God has walked with us through things. Don't say, yeah, my cousin was diagnosed with that thing and they only lived 3 days. Don't say that. We have to be careful that we don't hold out false hope. Oh yeah, my cousin had that and they lived for another 50 years. But that doesn't mean anything either, does it? So be careful what kind of experiences we share. But again, 2 Corinthians 1 verses 3 and 4, Paul says that God comforts us so we can comfort other people. Share with how God has walked with you through life and what you do to depend on God and what you have found to be helpful. Assure them that they have help. again, a big part of counseling is helping people who are hurting realize what their resources are. Maybe they have financial needs and they haven't stopped to think where their financial resources are coming from. Job's suffering turned around. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 17 that our light affliction that we experience in this life will give way to an exceeding weight of glory once we get to heaven. You know, sometimes the only encouragement we can give, like with godly parents whose child has turned their back on Christ, sometimes the only hope we can give is that there's no tears in heaven. I can't promise you your child is going to turn around and come back to Christ. I can't promise that. I don't know. But I know when you get to heaven, there'll be no tears. I trust the promises of God. And number 7, the one thing that we can do, the words that we can say is prayer. Twice in the last month, somebody has been in the hospital at Genesis and has mentioned Josh July praying with them in their hospital room. I'm so thankful that Josh can do that, and he does do that. Pray with them. Whether you're male or female, help them pray. Encourage them to pray, regardless of what they're doing or going through. We're being invaded. That's a sign that I got to quit. Our greatest assistance to those who are hurting can simply be our presence and our prayers. I hope you've gained something from our study of Job this morning. Let's take a break.